Hello everybody, my name is Michelle Noyes. I am Margarita's daughter. Margarita asked me to come back to talk with you again, this time about one of my favorite Greek myths. This is the story of the Odyssey. The Odyssey is actually a long story which has lots of adventures inside of it. So it's not your typical myth that's just one story. It's a long story. It's an epic story with lots of adventures. I learned this story when I was a child through listening to tapes, to an audio recording of a man telling the story. He was not reading the book. The book was written by Homer. He is a Greek bard, was blind, who would tell these amazing stories, and they were written down in the book and collected and called the Odyssey. This particular group of stories was called the Odyssey, and you can read it. But I learned the story before I was really able to read well enough to read this difficult classical book. So instead of reading it, I listened to a modern man telling the story in his own way. This man is named Odds Bodkins, and he is a bard like Homer was a bard. And he has a guitar, and he would play the guitar while he tells the stories and make music to set the mood of the story. He would also do voices and do sound effects and really make the story come alive. So I learned the adventures this way. I loved to listen to this story, and I would play these tapes on headsets while I was cleaning the house or doing dishes or folding clothes. I would love to listen to this story and other stories similar all the time. So my mother told me, you can't be listening to stories all the time, only when you're cleaning house. So I cleaned a lot so that I could keep listening to the story. So this is the story I'm going to tell you today. I'm not like Odds Bodkins. I don't have a guitar. I can't do the voices. But I can tell you what happened. Okay, so the Odyssey is actually a sequel to another long story called the Iliad, which is the story of the Trojan War, which is when the Greeks were fighting the Trojans over a woman, the most beautiful woman in the world, Helen. And but that's a totally different story. So the main character of the Odyssey is a man named Odysseus, and he was the king of a Greek island called Ithaca. And Odysseus led all the young soldiers of Ithaca to go fight for Greece in the Trojan War. And the war took 10 years. And all of that, the story of the war, is in the Iliad. The Odyssey begins when the Trojan War is over, and Odysseus and his men are ready to go home to Ithaca at last. Now, if you're reading the book doesn't tell the story in a straight line from the end of the Trojan War to when they get home. It moves about in time a little bit. So when the book starts, the scene is Ithaca, and Penelope, Odysseus's wife, has been trying to keep order in Ithaca while Odysseus was gone, and Odysseus' son, baby son, when he left, Telemachus, is all grown up. Now he's a man. It's 20 years after after Odysseus left, and no one has heard of Odysseus. They don't know if he is alive, or if he died in the war, or if he has died somehow in the 10 years since the end of the war. And but Penelope is still hoping that Odysseus will come home someday, even though it has been 20 years. In the meantime, all the children of Ithaca who grew up without fathers because their fathers left to fight the war are now young men in their 20s and 30s. And they have decided that Penelope should marry one of them.
Oh my gosh.
And then Ithaca will have a king again. So they, all of them, 108 young men, it's 108, move into Penelope's house.
And she's the queen.
She's the queen. But because she doesn't have a king, she can't really do anything about it. She's also a good hostess, and it would be very rude to kick them out. But it's also very rude of them to stay. And they stay, and they stay, and they eat all of her food, and they make messes. And
sounds like my house.
well, yeah. They're not trying to marry you, though.
Oh, yeah.
Margarita says it sounds like her house because she has lots of young Brazilians in her house eating her food. But they are not rude, and they are not trying to marry her. So it's okay. Anyway, Penelope is to the point where all of her wealth, all of her money is in her cattle and in her belongings, and these young men from her island are eating all of her cattle over months and months of living there, waiting for her to decide to marry one of them. Also, they're very badly behaved because they didn't have any fathers. So they are rough, they break things, they say rude things, they attack each other and fight in the dining room. They get drunk all the time. It's very bad for poor Penelope, who is waiting for her husband. And also bad for Telemachus, who is trying to become a man, and trying to become a good man, and these suitors want to get rid of Telemachus because he is the prince. So, Athena, the goddess of wisdom, who in the whole story, she is the goddess who loves Odysseus the most. She always tries to protect Odysseus and bring him home safely. Athena goes to Telemachus, and in a dream, or maybe she appears to him, I can't remember, she tells him that he should go look for news of his father, and sends Telemachus out on a journey. And Telemachus travels to Sparta, and there he learns that he hears news of Odysseus, that Odysseus has been held prisoner for 7 years by the nymph Calypso. And but he's still alive. And then the story shifts and goes over to Odysseus, who is with Calypso. So this is the beginning of part 2. The first part was all about Ithaca and Penelope and Telemachus. Part 2, we're with Odysseus. So Odysseus has been held captive by Calypso because Calypso is in love with Odysseus, and he rejects her. over and over again. So she drugs him and sedates him and holds him by force in her island. But now Athena is aware of this, and Athena complains to Zeus that Calypso should not be allowed to keep her favorite mortal prisoner forever. So Zeus, the father of Athena, sends Hermes to tell Calypso, you have to let him go. And Calypso grudgingly complies. Didn't have much choice. And she lets Odysseus go. And so but she doesn't help him leave. So he builds himself a raft out of driftwood and sets out into the open ocean, where he is shipwrecked. The raft eventually falls apart, and he swims as far as he can, but he's eventually exhausted and starts to sink. Where at this time he is saved by another nymph named, what is her name? Ino, or Ino. And she wraps her scarf around Odysseus's mouth and nose so he can breathe, and drags him to the shore of, these names are tough for me, there's so many foreign names, of an island. We'll find a way, we'll put the words up on the screen so that you can see how this is spelled. It sort of looks like it should be pronounced Sherry.
How do you spell it?
Scherie. And this is the home of the Phaeacians. And so he is unconscious, naked, dragged by this nymph into the shallows and left there. So this island, Sherry, or whatever it is, has a king and a queen and a princess. And Athena goes to the princess while she's sleeping. This is early morning. Odysseus is washed ashore. And she tells the princess, she gives her a dream and suggests to the princess Nausicaa, who's a child, like 11 years old, maybe you'll be married today. If you're married today, you won't have any clean sheets. You better go wash them. So Nausicaa wakes up and thinks, oh my goodness, what if I were to be married today? I wouldn't have any clean sheets. I better go wash them. So she gathers up all of her sheets, and she takes her servant girls, and they're all happy, and they go down to the shore, and they start to wash the sheets and play, and they discover this man, and it's Odysseus. Nausicaa thinks it's all very good fun, and so she wakes him up and invites him to come back to her home, and Odysseus is welcomed into the royal home of the Phaeacians. And while he's there, he doesn't reveal his identity. He claims to just be some other soldier from the Trojan War, and gives a little fake story about himself. And they accept it. And during one of the feasts, later on, after he's been there a couple days, they have a bard who starts telling the story of Troy. And Odysseus played a key part in the story of Troy. And as the bard is telling the story, his own story, Odysseus can't hide his emotion, and it comes out that he is actually Odysseus of the epic of the Iliad, the Odysseus of the Iliad. And so all the Phaeacians want to hear his story. Where has he been for the past 10 years? So then we move into part 3 of the Odyssey, where Odysseus tells his story from the beginning, or actually from the end of the Iliad. When Troy fell and the Greeks were victorious and it was time to go home, Odysseus set sail for Ithaca with 12 ships full of Ithacan soldiers that were the husbands and fathers from Ithaca, who also were going home with Odysseus. And they had fought in the war, and they were ready to go home. It had been 10 years of war. So they set sail, and at first their journey is uneventful. They stop, when they run out of supplies, they stop and raid places, and they're pirates, and they're having a grand old time. But then they hit a storm, and the storm blows them off course and into dangerous and magical waters. The water isn't magical, but after this point in the story, they bump into many fantastical beasts and characters that are not normal people. So they're lost, and they have just weathered a storm. They're low on supplies. This is always a problem for them. And they find an island. And so they go ashore, and this island is wonderful. It appears to be inhabited only by sheep, which is perfect because they love sheep. They love to eat sheep. So they bring all these sheep onto board, and Odysseus and several of his men go to explore the island, and they find a cave. And they go inside the cave. And inside the cave, they can tell that someone lives here because there's sheepskins and a fire pit and cheese and wine, or at least cheese. I think there's just cheese off to the side.
Wine too.
And maybe there's wine. They've brought with them wine. I don't know why, but it features in the story. Brandy. Actually, I think they got brandy earlier in the story somewhere. I've forgotten. I'm sorry. Somehow they have brandy with them.
Special brandy.
It's brandy that they got from a priest who was at a shrine, at one of the shrines they stopped to sacrifice at earlier when they were raiding, when they went ashore. So they have brought with them this very strong brandy that's really wonderful. So they go in there, and they eat some of the cheese, and then they decide to wait until whoever lives there comes home so that they can, I don't know, talk to the person. And that was a big mistake. When the person comes home, it turns out to be a cyclops. And if you heard the earlier tape, you know the cyclopses are big people, giant people with only one eye, big eye in their forehead. And they weren't too popular with the Titans, or most people don't like cyclopses. So this cyclops, apparently this island, cyclopses live on this island, and this cave, a cyclops named Polyphemus lives in this cave. And when he gets there, he sees the little men, and he instantly runs outside, drags a boulder up to the wall, and blocks the cave door, so no one can escape. And he proceeds to catch and eat one of the sailors, and ignore their total entreats. They're asking him to treat them like people, but he doesn't. He sees them as food that has wandered in, luckily, to his cave. And so he goes about his business. He brings in sheep to the cave. He's a shepherd. And every day he will take the sheep out and close up the cave door again, And then in the night, he'll bring the sheep back in, and he'll eat one of the sailors. And there's like 10 of them. And, of course, the sailors are very upset about this. And they start trying to think of what they can do. So the first night or the second night, or during the day, they find a big staff of wood, and they sharpen it to a point, and they harden it in the fire, and they hide it. And that night, when Polyphemus comes home and goes to sleep, when he comes home, after he's eaten one of them, Odysseus offers him some brandy. And Polyphemus takes it, and they get Polyphemus totally drunk. And so he sleeps really soundly that night. And that night, they get up, climb up onto his body, and they run, and they ram the staff into Polyphemus's eye, his most vulnerable spot, and they blind him. And he rampages around, but he can't catch them while he's blind. So eventually, he's exhausted from pain and rage and falls back asleep. And then Odysseus ties his men underneath the sheep. So they're underneath the sheep, holding on to the wool of the sheep, and Odysseus ties them up. And then Odysseus himself goes under the ram and just holds on because there's no one to tie him. And later, when miserable Polyphemus wakes up, he doesn't know what to do. So he decides to go about his normal business and take his sheep out to graze. And so he opens the door and sends them out, and he feels them with his hands to make sure nothing else is going through but his sheep. But because the soldiers are underneath the sheep, they get through. And it's important to know that earlier Polyphemus had asked Odysseus his name when he was giving him the brandy. And Odysseus had said his name was No Man. And so Polyphemus knew that no man had blinded him. So Polyphemus takes all his sheep out to graze, and as soon as they're out, Odysseus jumps out from under and starts cutting his men out from under the sheep. And they start running to the shore, and Polyphemus is an intuitive chap, and he realizes something is wrong, and he starts chasing them, and he starts bellowing, "No man, come back! You've blinded me, no man!" And Odysseus laughs at him as they're in rowboats, like rowing out to their boat, and he says, "It wasn't no man that blinded you, Polyphemus. It was Odysseus of Ithaca."
Stupid.
Biggest mistake of the entire Odyssey, probably, was revealing who he was. And Poseidon instantly drops to his knees and cries out to his father, Poseidon. Oh, who did I say?
Poseidon.
Polyphemus, the Cyclops, calls out to his father, Poseidon. I know I said before that the Cyclopses were fathered by the sky and the earth, but this one was fathered by Poseidon. So he says, "Poseidon, my father, Odysseus of Ithaca has blinded me, and please, may he be cursed. May he die and never make it home. But if it is his destiny to arrive home, may all his men die, and may he come home on a foreigner's ship. May he lose his ship, and may his journey be long and painful." And then Polyphemus picked up boulders and started hurling them at the ship. But Odysseus made it to the ship, got on there, and they sailed away. And from that time on, they had troubles. And it ended up, the next place they sailed was, they sailed to Aeolus. Aeolus was the man who was the king of the wind. and he was a kindly old man, and he took a liking to Odysseus, and so he decided to give him a very wonderful present. He would put all of the winds into a bag, and except for the west wind, which was kindly and would take them straight home to Ithaca. And he also gave them lots of treasure and provisions, everything. Provisions is food and water, what they would need to sail. He gives them everything they need and sets them on their journey. And they sail, no problem. Short amount of time. Odysseus stays awake at the helm, at the rudder of the front ship. And I think it takes something like 5 days to a week. He doesn't sleep the whole time because he's really on edge and he's careful because he heard what Polyphemus had said. And when they're finally within sight of Ithaca, Odysseus decides it's safe, he can go sleep. And while he's sleeping, his men are overcome with curiosity as to what is in the bag that Aeolus gave to Odysseus. And so they open it up, and all the winds escape from the bag, and an incredible maelstrom and tornado and hurricane and every bad thing that can come from wind happens because you've got all the winds together mixed up, and a terrible storm rages, and it drives the boats all the way back to Aeolus. And when Odysseus comes weeping to Aeolus, begging him to do it again, please, it was a mistake, just put it back in the bag, Aeolus won't do it because he sees that Odysseus is cursed, and there's no point in fighting a curse. So from then on, Odysseus has to sail on without help. The next place they go is they find another island. They need provisions. This island has very tall cliffs around it, so there's no beach, so they can't come ashore. But there is a cove where the cliffs come to a point, and inside there's a lagoon. So Odysseus doesn't like the look of it, but his men are hungry. They decide, the other 11 ships decide they want to go into this lagoon. It will be a rest from storms. It will be a safe place without wind. They can rest there. So they all go in, whereas Odysseus keeps his ship just outside. And it turns out that inside there's cliffs too, but at least it's sheltered. Turns out that the people who live on this island are cannibals, and they eat other people. And they're called the Lestrygonians. Something like that. Lestrygonians. I like that. So they start terrorizing the people by tossing boulders from the cliffs down onto the ships, smashing up the ships, and then sending down fish hooks and hooking the people and dragging them up the cliffs and eating them. And it's very upsetting and very scary and horrible for Odysseus. And so most of the ships start trying to get out, but there's only a tiny way out. Only one ship can get out at a time. And so the ships are smashing into each other, and in the end, all 11 ships are lost, and all those sailors. Only Odysseus' ship is saved and able to sail away from the island of the Lestrygonians. So, the one ship continues sailing, and they come to another island, and they're very nervous about going onto this island. They don't know what would be there, but they do need to go aboard and get on land and get food. So Odysseus and, or I think Odysseus sends his first in command, but somehow some of the men go ashore. Did I miss the lotus eaters? I think I I totally missed the Lotus Eaters story. Oh well, there's another adventure that had already happened, but we'll go on with this one. So they go ashore, and it's a beautiful island. And there are these elegant, graceful buildings surrounded by tame animals and lush vegetation. They go ashore, and they're met by a beautiful woman who invites them in. Odysseus is not with them. Invites them in and feeds them a feast. And the men are so hungry and so happy to be eating, they just start stuffing themselves. And the woman watches them, and she notes that they are eating like pigs. And then she starts running through them and smacking them with her staff. Bam, bam, bam. And each one she hits turns into a pig. Turns out that this island is owned by Circe, a witch, sea witch kind of lady, magician. And she turns them all into pigs, all the guys who went ashore, and adds them to her collection of tame animals. Odysseus eventually realizes that his men have been gone too long, and so he goes ashore. But Hermes comes to him and warns him that a magical woman lives here, and Hermes gives him a bitter root to eat that will protect him from Circe's magic. So Odysseus is protected. So he eats the root. It's nasty, but he eats it, and he goes ashore. He goes in, and he sees Circe. And he demands that she turn the men back into men from pigs.
Pigs back into men.
Yeah. So she is very taken with his resistance. I think he actually threatens to strangle her, and she's impressed with his strength. And so she says she will turn his men back into men if he will stay with her. And she's very beguiling, very beautiful. So he agrees to stay with her, at least for a while. And she turns his men back into men. They all come ashore, and they're able to have a good rest there. And Circe and Odysseus get along wonderfully. Let me pause here and just mention the adventure that they had earlier. It was actually before the Cyclops. They came ashore on one island, and it was full of people laying around in this deep ivy, eating lotuses, which are big white flowers. And they were, basically these lotuses were like, sort of like marijuana. They definitely got high on these lotuses, and they didn't want to do anything. They just wanted to lie around and laugh and eat more lotuses. So some of the men, the two men who were sent ashore originally to explore, get sucked in and become lotus eaters themselves. And,
addicts.
Yeah, addicts. They're addicted to the lotuses. But Odysseus comes and finds them and drags them away and tells them to man up and come back. Too bad, considering what's going to happen later. He should have just left them there. They were happy. Anyway, that happened before the incident with Polyphemus, the Cyclops. That's probably where they got the brandy, come to think of it.
From the Lotus Eaters?
From the Lotus Eaters and their priest on their shrine. I bet that's right. Okay, anyway. So, it's right after... What just happened? Circe. They're at Circe's island. And eventually, Odysseus decides he has to continue on to home, to Ithaca. And Circe agrees. Circe decides to help him as much as she can. She really likes him. So but before she tells him how to move on to Ithaca, she sends him on a journey to visit the land of the dead.
Why?
I don't know. I always wondered that. It always seemed like a detour. But the result of this journey is that Odysseus gets a lot of information from people who are dead. So she sends him to a place where he can sail his boat onto the river Styx and down to sort of the crossroads. He doesn't go too far into the land of the dead, but just sort of to the edge. And there he kills a lamb. And when the shades come to him, the shades can't speak, and they have no memories. So, but when they drink the blood of the lamb, they are able to speak and remember for a short time. So he meets his own mother there, and from her learns about what's going on in the house with Penelope and all of those bad men. He also talks with Agamemnon, who has loads of stories about him. He's a very famous guy who was also in the Greek and Trojan War. But Odysseus hadn't known he was dead. Agamemnon made it all the way home. But when he arrived home, his wife was already remarried to someone else, and his wife and her lover kill him. So that's why Agamemnon, after all of his trouble, ends up dead. Also, he sees lots of other people, including Ajax, who there's stories about Odysseus and Ajax in the Iliad, and I believe Ajax kills himself after losing a fight with Odysseus or something like that. The men vote that Odysseus should get Achilles' armor instead of Ajax, and so Ajax is so upset that he kills himself, and that was very upsetting to Odysseus because Ajax was his friend. So Odysseus sees a lot of people down there and learns some things about what's going on back home. And then Odysseus sails home. Odysseus sails back to Circe. And Circe then gives him instructions on how to safely pass the various difficulties which are coming. So the first thing that Odysseus' ship meets as he's sailing to Ithaca from Circe is the sirens. And no person can resist the song of death that the sirens sing. And the sirens lure sailors. The sailors almost become fevered and desperate to get to the sirens. And so Circe warned Odysseus about this. And so she warned him to have all of his men plug their ears with beeswax so that they couldn't hear the song of death. But Odysseus is curious to hear the song of death. So he commands his men to tie him to the mast so that he cannot jump overboard and swim to the sirens. And this way they're able to safely sail past the Sirens' island. It's just like a bare rock, really. And Odysseus experiences the fever and the temptation and the madness to get to them. But they sail on to the point where it's out of earshot. He can't hear it anymore. And they're okay. The next challenge is they're going to come to some straits. A strait, when you're sailing, in sailing terms, a strait is a very narrow place. And this particular strait runs between a cliff in which lives a monster, a dragon with, 6 heads, named Scylla. And then on the other side is a whirlpool, at the bottom of which sits a monster named Charybdis. And Charybdis creates the whirlpool by drinking in the entire ocean and then spewing it back out. And this is what creates the tides. So, Circe recommends that Odysseus sail his boat very close to the cliff with Scylla. That way, his boat will not be sucked in to Charybdis. But it does mean that he will lose 6 men, because the 6 heads of Scylla will come out and take 6 men. But if they keep going and don't freak out, it'll only be 6, and they won't take another swipe at the boat. So this is what they do. They sail through, they lose 6 men, they avoid Charybdis. So they keep going, and then they get to the island of Thrinacia. And Circe has told them Thrinacia is safe. But this is the island where Helios, either Apollo or Helios, keeps, who are the sun gods, they keep their cattle, because in ancient Greece, cattle was part of wealth. So the gods are well off, they have cattle. So the cattle on Thrinacia belongs to a god, and it's sacred, and you can't eat it, can't touch it. So they land there. The cattle is tame and wonderful, and they rest, and they're so happy to be safe after seeing so much death, losing so many friends, and they rest there. But a hurricane comes up, and it storms and it storms and it storms, and while it's storming, they can't sail away, so they're stuck on Thrinacia. And slowly they start running out of food. So eventually they start to starve. And when they're starving, the cattle of the god start to look very tempting. And eventually, at one point, Odysseus is off praying, and his men kill some of the cattle. And they make a barbecue, and they eat, and they feast. And when Odysseus gets back, it's too late. And then all hell starts breaking loose, and the skins from the cattle start mooing and moving around and chasing the men all over the place. And they run to the boats, and they try to escape. And the god who owned the cattle, either Apollo or Helios, complains to Zeus and demands judgment. And so Zeus sends a thunderbolt and destroys the ship. And everyone drowns except Odysseus, who is rescued by Calypso. And that is how Odysseus got to Calypso's island in the first place. Calypso is a nymph, and she keeps him there for 7 years. And only at the end of 7 years is she finally commanded to set him free, and he eventually washes ashore on the island of the Phaeacians. And that is how Odysseus concludes his tale that he's telling to the king and the queen and the princess Nausicaa. So then part 4 of the Odyssey begins. We jump back to present day, where Odysseus is with the Phaeacians, and Penelope and Telemachus are off in Ithaca dealing with the suitors. And as Odysseus has concluded his story, the Phaeacians are very moved, and they want to help Odysseus as much as they can. So the first thing they do is offer for Odysseus to marry Nausicaa. but she is only a child, and Odysseus is trying to get home to his wife. So he politely declines. So they say, okay, well, if you don't want to marry our princess, then we will give you a ship, and we will load you up with provisions, and we will deliver you to Ithaca. So Odysseus says thank you, and he then says he's very tired, and so he goes to sleep. And while he's sleeping, they prepare the ship, and they put him on it, and they start to sail. And he's actually quite close to Ithaca. And before he awakes, Ithaca is in sight. And they say goodbye, and they put him on shore. Now, Athena meets him on the shores of Ithaca, and she says, okay, you can't just walk into your house, or else all the suitors together will attack you and kill you. So I'm going to give you a disguise. And Athena transforms Odysseus into a cripple, a beggar cripple in rags with a big hunch on his back, and says, okay, there you go, and Odysseus starts walking towards his house. And by evening, he gets to the outskirts, and he asks one of his servants who takes care of the lands, to house him. And Odysseus goes in, and the servant doesn't recognize Odysseus, but is a good man, and so he offers him hospitality. During this time, Telemachus is just returning from his trip to Sparta. So he also decides to stop for the night at the home of this groundskeeper. I'm trying to see if I have a name for the groundskeeper. No, I don't. That's okay. He's just a servant. Anyway, moving right along. Odysseus reveals himself to his son Telemachus. And it's really quite incredible that Telemachus believes that it's Odysseus, because Telemachus has never met Odysseus, and it's been 20 years. But Telemachus believes him, and they decide to come up with a plan. So they make a plan together, father and son. The next day, Telemachus goes on ahead of Odysseus and avoids a what's the word for when they set you a trap and they're going to fall upon you?
Ambush.
Ambush, yeah. So Telemachus avoids an ambush on the way back with the help of Athena, but he makes it back and sort of slips back into the household. Meanwhile, Odysseus arrives and asks for hospitality as a beggar. While Odysseus is there, he witnesses the lifestyle of these men, and he actually is there while they're upset that Telemachus is back, so they beat up Telemachus. And he sees them mocking Penelope and trying to force her to choose one of them, and just rabble-rousing. And that evening, Penelope has, hold on one sec. So the housekeeper takes mercy on the beggar, Odysseus, and shows him hospitality and offers to wash his feet. And as she's washing his feet, she finds a scar that she recognizes as being on the feet of her beloved master, Odysseus. And she realizes that it's him. I think she was even maybe his nursemaid when he was a child. And it's a very moving reunion, but he swears her to secrecy. So Telemachus and this maid, do I have her name? Yeah, Euryclea, I believe is how you pronounce it. Euryclea is the name of the nursemaid. Anyway, that evening, Penelope has had enough. And so she has this scheme to get rid of the suitors once and for all. So she takes them, she comes down and she says, okay, I will marry whichever one of you can string my husband's bow and shoot it through 12 axe heads that have this little hole, like just the size of an arrow, punched in these axe heads, and they line them all up. So the shot has to be very straight and very steady to make it through. This is something Odysseus used to do for fun, as sort of like a party trick. So she knew Odysseus could do it, and no one else had ever been able to do it. So she figured, she said she would marry whoever could do it, but if that man could not do it, he had to leave and not come back. So she figured no one would be able to do it, and they would all leave her in peace. So they all are getting ready to try this. The first part of this difficult task is to string Odysseus's bow, which is so big and heavy and stiff that nobody can do it. They try and try and try with all their might. These young men, they can't bend the bow far enough over to stretch the string up and hook it in the notch. Except for one man is very clever, and he heats up the bow in the fire, and he puts a lot of oil on the bow till it's softer, and using all of his strength, he's able to just barely bend the bow far enough to pop the string in. I think. At least that's how he attempts to do it. Needless to say, he's not able to shoot it through the axe heads, so it doesn't matter anyway. When all of the suitors have failed, they are very angry and they refuse to leave. They say it wasn't a fair test. Right then, just as it's getting heated, Odysseus, the beggar, asks if he can try. The suitors let him try just for sport, with much abuse. They throw a chair at him first. And then they let him try just because it'll be funny to watch this old cripple try to do what they couldn't do. And to everyone's vast surprise, great surprise, Odysseus does it without any trouble at all. Strings the bow, whips out an arrow, shoots it through the axe head into the wall on the other side. And just like that, Athena removes his disguise. He rises up, the rightful king of Ithaca, Odysseus, home from the war. And he and Telemachus and some of the other faithful servants turn on the suitors and drive them forth. And they purge the household. I think he actually kills all of them. And also they kill the unfaithful servants who had been disrespectful to Penelope and abusing the absence of Odysseus. And so they purge the household. Penelope, however, had already retired to her room in despair. And she sleeps through the whole thing. All of the fighting and mayhem. After everything's done, Odysseus creeps quietly up to Penelope's room and reveals himself to her. She wakes her up, reveals himself to her, and she doesn't believe it. She can't believe it. She's been disappointed for so long. She can't believe it. So she gives him a test. She says, well, my husband was very strong, so if you can move our bed from here over to the other side of the room where I would prefer it, then I'll believe it's Odysseus. But Odysseus reacts in grief because the bed was made from a live olive tree, still rooted in the ground. And if it's possible to move the bed, then it means Penelope chopped down the olive tree and severed their living marriage bed. And when Penelope sees Odysseus' reaction, and when Odysseus says, surely you didn't chop down the olive tree, she knows it's him because he was the only one who knew the secret of the olive tree and the bed. So she believes him, and they are reunited, Penelope, Odysseus, and Telemachus. That was the end of the story that I learned. I'm not sure if it's the end of the book. I know there are alternate additional endings that some people tack on about how Odysseus reintegrates into Ithaca. They're not very happy with him because they've lost 2 generations of men now. The first to soldiers in Troy, the second because Odysseus just killed them all because they were all the suitors. But he eventually, things get smoothed over and he becomes again the happy king of Ithaca. And that is the story of the Odyssey.
Very good.
Any questions?
That was correct. Did they get Helen back?
Yes, they did. And she was happy. Helen had been the wife of somebody, and then, what's his name from Troy? Paris? From Troy carried her off because Aphrodite had promised that he should marry the most beautiful woman in the world. So he thought he had a right to carry her off with the help of Aphrodite because Helen was the most beautiful woman. And that's why the Greeks went to get Helen back. And they did with the help of Athena. But all of that is in the Iliad.
Do you think, I was struck by the role of fate when Aeolus refused to help him because he was cursed and there was no point. So did the Greeks believe that once you had a certain fate, you couldn't escape it?
So the question was about fate and whether the Greeks believed that you could escape your fate or not, since Aeolus wouldn't help Odysseus once he realized that he was cursed. In Greek mythology, there were 3 sisters who were called the Fates, right? And they have threads, and one of them has a thread that is the lifeline of mortals, and she cuts it. And when she cuts the thread, then that person is destined to die. So there's definitely a role of fate in Greek mythology that is determined. But you definitely see characters acting like they have free will and gods interfering with fate or determining people's destiny, and gods fighting with each other over the destiny of mortals. So it seems to me that it's sort of a both and. They have a concept of fate and curse and destiny, but they also have gods who are perhaps more powerful than destiny. Since the gods are more powerful perhaps than the fates, they could probably command the fates to do something differently if they really wanted to. Is that a fair? We have a person here while I'm recording who studied the classics, and so she knows a lot of things, and so I'm asking her if what I'm saying is correct with our understanding of the classical Greek mythology. Is that what you understand?
It's pretty accurate. The gods do have a lot of power, and the fates are they're not mentioned very much. They're kind of shrouded in a little bit of mystery. So I would say you're both and. It's probably very accurate.
So she said that the gods are very powerful and mentioned all the time. The fates aren't mentioned very often, and they're shrouded in mystery. So they have power, but it's not really it's not specified exactly how fate and destiny interact with free will, and especially with the gods' will.
Is there any historical basis for any of this? For instance, was there Helen? Was there a Trojan War? Do you know?
I think so. I think there was a Trojan War, was there? So the question was, is there historical, did any of this happen historically that we know for sure? And the question was there a Helen of Troy? Was there a Trojan War? I believe there was a Trojan War. And
There was a Helen.
and tradition says it was started by Helen, Helen of Troy, the face that launched 1,000 ships. But I don't know if we have hard evidence, conclusive proof, that Helen existed, other than these writings about her.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, that's it for today. Hopefully I'll get to talk with you again sometime soon. Bye!